a couple of things. One was that last spring, Sue Drucker, I noticed we were at, there's the standard routine of different conferences that academics go to throughout the year, and Sue seemed especially distressed at one in particular, but over the idea that we kind of expected that when we gathered together for those conferences, we would want to talk about everything that was going on, and instead it was like no one wanted to talk at all. Like it was like sort of weird. And then shortly after that, I think the timing is this way. In May, several of us, Sue and me and Tom and Corey Anton, who is not here, he's in Michigan, recorded a podcast with Lance. Lance does the IGS Semantic Reactions podcast, and it was basically an hour or more of just kind of talking about a bunch of the things that are going on in higher education. And it was such an interesting conversation, and it seemed like we had just barely scratched the surface of all the things potentially to talk about. And so that just made me think that maybe we should pick up and talk some more. And I always like to round up some other people, and so we've got this great panel of people to talk with tonight. And so let me introduce you to these people, and then what we'll do is each of them will give some opening remarks, 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll do kind of a group sort of a discussion, and then eventually we'll open it out to the rest of you for questions, comments, and all of that good stuff. So here are our panelists in alphabetical order. Did you say? It's not in alphabetical order too, so that's good. Okay, so Missy Alexander is Provost Emeritus of Western Connecticut State University. Prior to being appointed to the position of Provost, she served as Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at WCSU. At Marist College, she taught communication, focusing on theory, research, and ethics. For several years, she served in leadership roles in the New York State Communication Association, which we did together, yes, as pedagogy editor of Explorations in Media Ecology, that's the MEA journal, and as associate editor of Etc., the IGS journal. Dr. Alexander earned her PhD in media ecology from New York University with me, and her BA and MA from Hunter College. Since her retirement, she has focused on the arts, serving as president on 2 boards, the Mariall Center and the Sherman Players. When not organizing programming, seeking donations, or painting the stairs, she performs with the trio, the Red Dirt Girls, and with her husband, Bill, Pat Candace, where are you there, in Yours Truly. Susan Drucker is a distinguished professor of journalism in the Department of Journalism/Media Studies in the School of Communication at Hofstra University. She is an attorney and a treasurer of the Urban Communication Foundation. She is the author and editor or co-editor of 13 books and over 200 articles and book chapters, oh my, including the Urban Communication Reader, Volumes 1 and 2, Voices in the Street, Gender, Media, and Public Space, and Urban Communication Regulations, Communication Freedoms, and Limits. Her work examines the relationship between media technology and human factors, particularly as viewed from a legal perspective. Nadine Strawson is Professor Emerita of New York Law School and Senior Fellow at FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. She was president of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1991 to 2008. An internationally acclaimed free speech scholar and advocate, Strawson serves on the advisory boards of the ACLU and several academic freedom and free speech organizations. She is the host and project consultant for Free to Speak, a 3-hour documentary film series distributed on public television in 2023. Her most recent book is The War on Words, 10 Arguments Against Free Speech and Why They Fail. So, we didn't really decide in advance in what order people would start, but I mean, we can go alphabetically if you like. That's as good as any. And so I'm going to get out of the way and pass the mic on to Missy.
All right, Peggy.
So I'm the one who asked for the microphone because every time I'm here, I hear everybody go, I can't and back. And now I'm really glad I did because the piano is really nice and loud behind us. Anyway, I will start with probably the least sexy part of the conversation tonight, as if we can talk about any of this being sexy. But, the external forces that are going on in terms of attacks on higher ed are really important, and I know that they're front of mind. But I'm going to start with, to paraphrase a former president, it's demographics, stupid. In reality, or a reality of what is going on, is a shrinking population. Now, I want to be clear, a bunch of my friends in this room probably are going, hey, our enrollment's up this year, and it was up last year. Yay, we're coming back. That's the end, by the way. This is the punctuation. The next 15 years is decline. Okay, that's the reality of who was born. Okay, these are not made up numbers. WICHE tracks this really well, and they tend to do it. So Western states are planning on or experiencing probably 20% decline in high school graduates. In the Midwest, it'll be a 16% decline. In the southern states, a 3% growth. This is through 2040. And then in the Northeast, another 17% decline, as if we haven't already had a 20% decline. Okay. Now, at the same time, the proportion of white people is also shrinking. Now, I want you to understand that from my point of view, is a lot of what's going on in the crazy talk outside of higher ed, okay, and sort of the assault. But let me just give you a little bit of that rundown, because what happens is we see white high school grads shrinking by 26%, while Hispanic will be up 16%, African American down 22%, multiracial up 68%. All of that, for those of us in higher education, is an exciting change. And we've been working on it for a long time, sometimes effectively, sometimes not. But what I want to hammer home is the total number is still lower, right? Because a lot of people went, okay, we'll go get this group and then we'll be fine. No, the total number is lower. But we have had to learn to adapt, right? We've had to learn to be better at serving a broader population. All right, so that's just my context. I want you to understand that, because right now everybody's feeling like they just survived a big mess, but it's only the start of it. Sorry, I didn't do anything happy there. All right, now I want to just talk for a minute about what we have done that is problematic and we're going to have to carve our way out of. Okay, so here's something interesting. We have turned ourselves into all the same. We have shrunk the differentiation between our organizations in such a way that now we are caught in a corner about how to argue our way out of it. Now, you're going to laugh, but it all starts with AP. AP credit starts in the 1950s. It starts as actually prep school study to see how we can bolster people to move ahead faster so we can compete in the Cold War. Right? And that's great. We think AP is fine. Then we found out AP was actually racist, right? As we learned to broaden, we kept seeing that we were only getting a certain number of students into AP, and we grew it. But the end result is, at least to today, is that AP made it very clear that we could just define at least the first year of education as testable, not experiential. And so this is, I mean, how do they get their credit? They take a College Board test to determine how much they know about English literature or psychology or calculus. And those may be good things to know, but it absolutely changes the definition of what we mean by the first year of college. And now we're also caught in a cost situation. Anybody who's worked at a regional comprehensive knows that the goal is to get students out with less debt. They can't afford it. So we're trying to get them to take more of those AP credits, which means they're taking less of a college experience, right? It's knowledge, but is it college? Okay, so this is one area that we've made ourselves in a corner. The second is community college, which is an amazingly positive American invention. I want to be clear. I think I'm like a huge fan that we came up with it. But it actually starts as a way to keep people out of university. It was junior college. And it said, let's try to not teach, by a bunch of researchers at University of Chicago said, we don't want to teach that crap. Let's put that over here, have them do this for 2 years, and then we'll take them when they're ready to be on our research projects, right? University was something different. It evolved into what we know as community college now, which is a combination of transfer programs to try to go from there into the 4-year, and some vocational programs, which are increasingly being blended with the transfer programs. Great stuff, but the impetus is now, and the investment is in the community college infrastructure so that it's cheaper for students who would then want to go on to university, right? Well, guess what that does? It means that unless you're a university with a brand name recognized, you've just lost your income for your first 2 years. Now we have another problem that we're in. We also have to ask ourselves, what's the difference? We've all had to align our curriculum if you were in a state system like the one I was in, but actually SUNY does the same thing. They had aligned their gen eds to make sure it was transferable, so then how are you different, how are you unique? The last example I'm going to give, because everybody else needs to come up here, and I know some of you just went through this, everybody's at university now! Yeah. Okay, it's a nice thing. I guess your admissions people thought that people would come from Europe now or Asia to your school because now you're university. Joke's on us, because nobody's allowed to come to the United States right now. But it's a really problematic thing to have them all become a university. And here's why, right? Vassar College has no trouble being a college. It knows that it's an undergraduate focused place. They have a couple of grad programs, don't get me wrong, but they're an undergraduate focused place with a lot of really talented faculty working with a lot of really talented students. When you change the name to university, there are expectations. And those expectations are around research, around breadth of programs, around breadth of graduate programs, that most of these colleges that just made that leap cannot sustain. You need to have significant reatime time for faculty if you want that research profile. Guess what? The grants aren't even available to make the research program happen. They never were, by the way, for our small, like Marist College is now Marist University, right? They never were available for us. They were always available for the elites anyway, but at this point, they're not even available. And you get this kind of false expectations about what it is. So in addition to us trying to reach out and save ourselves on this last thing, we have in fact made it even more impossible to distinguish ourselves because we're competing with the wrong pool. So my story is a tale of woe, of course, about demographics, but also about us, because what we've done is compressed. The attacks on us are easy with these equivalencies. Okay, why should we fund that? You can do it at the community college. Why should we fund that? You can do it elsewhere. It makes it very hard to make us distinct. So we have a very clear problem, and the solutions for it are very challenging in sort of backing up and saying, okay, now how do we become more distinct again? I think people had good intentions. I think we kept trying to be more inclusive, honestly, except for that university move. That was a clear money move, okay? But it's not going to help us sustain in the demographic storm ahead.
All right. Sorry.
I think each speaker is going to end with, sorry. We didn't promise this was going to be like a happy night, but we're going to try to at least sort of feel it together. I don't know. So Sue's up next.
Keeping with the depressing theme. This will be no problem keeping up with that theme. I'm going to focus a little bit on, particularly on higher education and the threats that higher education are experiencing currently. Threats to higher education are not new and not unprecedented. And what we're witnessing is unprecedented efforts to target, to intimidate, to exert extreme control over U.S. higher education by external and internal forces. And certainly it is not a U.S. Only situation. We're talking about activities that are evidenced in universities, in autocracies globally. And that should be a wake-up call. Threats to higher education are both external and internal. I would like, and I think that some of what Missy talked about are some of the internal issues, and I think that I hope we'll talk more about some of the internal pressures that universities are feeling now. I just want to focus my opening comments on some external pressures. And again, not new. You can go back to none other than the tapes of conversations between Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. So 1972, Nixon was heard to say, the press is the enemy, the establishment is the enemy, the professors are the enemy. I consider that pretty good company, at least for the press. But not to be outdone, and certainly not to be original, J.D. Vance, before he became vice president, is quoted as saying, universities, not just professors, universities are the enemy. And we have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities of this country. I told you I wasn't going to be uplifted. So, higher education is increasingly viewed with skepticism, and it now finds itself under attack, like I said, internally, and we'll talk, I think, some of the demographics certainly, the financial exigencies certainly play a role, the politics of the people in our classrooms play a role. But if we focus on the external, higher education is, and has for a long time, been viewed with a degree of skepticism. And so the attacks that we find ourselves under right now by the current administration is not all that surprising. The ivory tower has long been cast as elitist and disconnected and not really aware or relevant to everyday society. And I think that we need to kind of deal with the elephant in the room, the historical distrust of a system of academic freedom, of academic tenure, that is often the political fodder of political candidates and elected officials. Then they like to make higher education institutions that value things like tenure as kind of devil terms. That there's something wrong with that. That you're dealing with the idea that there's a devaluation of the value of debate, of research, of scholarship, and the freedom from interference. Where once education, higher education, was seen as the ticket of upward mobility, of better wages, of better benefits, of being respected in one's community, that's become more and more elusive, particularly those saddled with educational debt, with crushing debt. And that financial situation, that financial exigency or reality, is something that I think we really have to deal with in terms of where higher education is right now. I have students who think that their high tuition fees are going directly into their rich professors' pockets. So let me tell you how I cope with that. Anyway, I think the point is that what higher education used to mean has become more and more elusive. That it's no longer seen as a guarantor of opportunity. And I think that's dangerous. I think that's a serious thing to consider. I recently read a book by Philadelphia Inquirer journalist William Bunch, and the title of the book is After the Ivory Tower Falls. And he basically argues that the college problem really represents a big part of the divisions, of the very deep divisions in American culture right now. What he's arguing is that perhaps the major divider in society right now is the devaluation of higher education, the distrust of college elites, the fact that there seems to be a division between Americans in terms of higher education that he's arguing may be greater than divisions of class, of culture, of geography, of ideology. That the real division, the real driver of division is our attitudes about higher education. This is going on at the same time as I think we see a rise in the distrust of experts and expertise. Experts are being cast aside. There's, I think, resentment bubbling up from beneath the surface that's now ushered onto center stage. I think there's an unrelenting onslaught of attacks against the fundamental institutions of democracy in general. And higher education in general, and higher education in particular, is one of those fundamental institutions of democracy. It teaches, it's one of the most important. It's about an informed electorate. It's about civic engagement. It's about social mobility. It's about providing spaces for dialogue even if you disagree. And that is being devalued. In terms of issues of general semantics, I hope that we get to the role that language plays in this regard. The use of redefinition of fundamental terms like discrimination. I think, and certainly I think we should be talking about Hayakawa's ladder of abstraction. The bottom line is, ultimately, I fear, or maybe the right word is I mourn, for what's become of the value placed on education for education's sake, on the value of the liberal arts, on the value of a life of the mind. I've been privileged to live a life of the mind, and to see the respect for that in our culture, in our society, dissolving before my eyes, is painful. So I wish I could be more upbeat, and maybe as we continue with the discussion I can be. Right now, sorry for the downer.
Thanks, Sue. Next up is Nadine.
Thank you so much, Peggy. I promise you that I will end for sure on an upbeat note after continuing with laying out some of the challenges, in addition to being a scholar and a professor, at this point emeritus professor, but still a scholar and writer. I am an activist, and you cannot be an activist without being an optimist. For anybody who gets an email from me, if you ever have the patience to read all the way down to the bottom, one of the quotes that I have there, which comes from two other scholars / activists, goes something like this: optimism is more a result of activism than its cause. And it's really true. So I'm here to report from the front lines that engaging with people like you, engaged and committed faculty members and students all over the country and all over the world, which is what I do constantly, there is so much reason for hope. Yes, it's a shrinking student pool. That is really too bad, but they are such inspiringly wonderful human beings who are committed to all of the best values that all of us have committed our lives to. Now, I want to say, Peggy, you gave me a wonderful introduction, but you left out my two most important credentials, which is I had the honor of giving the Alfred Korbisky lecture a couple of years ago, and I'm also an honorary fellow. I think that's the title, right, Lance?
Just fellow.
Just fellow. I'm a just fellow of this wonderful organization, and so I'm particularly delighted to be here and to share the panel with such outstanding colleagues and friends. On a sobering note, for me, the elephant in the room is, every day you're hit with more shocks. What next? So now it's murder. Now it's murder on a campus where I myself spoke quite recently, and I remember it for being so beautiful and so tranquil. So the shock of this murder is even greater. But let me add a really sobering fact here. According to survey results that were released just yesterday by FIRE, one of the organizations that I work very closely with, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, you may have heard, I'm sure many people have heard, of FIRE's very well discussed rankings of colleges and universities every year for the past 6 years. Extremely extensive survey this year. 70,000 students were surveyed at 257 campuses. It's done by College Pulse, which is an expert organization. It's by far the largest survey of college students. And even yesterday, before I could imagine that there would be this murder, I was so sobered by one of the statistics that college students now feel so strongly about how dangerous and harmful it is to have speakers on their campuses whose ideas they disagree with, whose ideas they consider harmful and dangerous, that here are the exact statistics. The number of students who who believe that it is at least sometimes appropriate to deplatform a speaker, 71%. The percentage of students who believe that it is at least sometimes appropriate to physically block other students from going to hear a speaker that the blockers don't want them to hear, 54%. And here is the most chilling. The percentage who believe that it is at least sometimes appropriate to use violence to stop a speaker from speaking, 34%, more than 1/3. And there is I'm all in favor of bipartisanship, but not in this context. One of the trends in the past, the suppressive instincts have come, and actions and beliefs have come mostly from the left end of the spectrum, and we can debate and discuss what the reason for that is. But that has changed For this year, for the first time, there are substantial pluralities of students who describe themselves as Republicans and conservatives who support these speech suppressive tactics. And in fact, the students who describe themselves as strong Republicans exceeded their support for violence to shut down a speaker, exceeded those who defined themselves as strong Democrats. So sadly, I think there may be not as much mourning on campus among students over this horrible murder as clearly we all feel in this room. Well, in terms of I'm mostly going to concentrate on the external threats to education because that's what I deal with as a lawyer and as an activist. I wanted to start though by giving some examples. It's almost impossible to keep up with everything that is going on. As head of the ACLU, I used to be keeping up with the whole civil liberties spectrum, everything from A to Z, or abortion to zero tolerance and everything in between. For the past 10 years, it has been a real challenge just to keep up with attacks on free speech, and that's become dramatically increased under the Trump administration. One of the backup documents I have here is a wonderful resource from the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I've got two-sided copy, a printout here, Tracking Trump's Higher Ed Agenda. I highly recommend it, but line by line, this is a compendium of the executive actions, the memos, the agency actions, and the lawsuits. It's a full-time, more than a full-time job, just to try to keep track of it. Just to give you a flavor of the last 2 days, I'll give you a couple of samples of just some of the significant developments just in the last 2 days. First, yesterday, we got the nation's report card about the dismal and abysmal results of student testing in math and science and English. The lowest levels ever in the entire history of this report card being issued, which goes back decades. And I know that does not directly relate to higher education, but of course we know it's going to have an enormous impact on higher education sooner rather than later. I already mentioned the fire report. Sadly, I've given you only a couple of the lowlights from that report. To give you just one other conclusion, the universities themselves. I was thinking of this, Sue, when you were talking, and both of you talked about internal. To some extent, we really have to be self-critical. We have presented an easy target for those who hate universities, although and many of us have spent, and myself included, a lot of time and a lot of effort constructively criticizing the problems in universities, including the self-censorship and the censorship that's been done by university faculty members and students and administrators who should have known better. But I do want to draw a big distinction here. And one of my friends put it very well when he said, some of us love universities and therefore we criticize them in order to reform and improve them. Others hate universities and therefore they criticize them to destroy the universities. So that's a huge distinction. But FIRE, has given, of the 257 universities, FIRE does not engage in grade inflation. So it's, the strict curve, 2020, 2020, 2020. And of the 257 universities, 166 get failing grades. So even the university that is number one in terms of protecting free speech for students and faculty members just barely has a B- grade. And the bottom line is that, even the ones that are the best, we're really talking about the least bad. When you talk about the degree of self-censorship by students, it's really shocking. The issues we talk about, I think both of you alluded to, probably Sue in particular. One of the major functions of universities in our society is educating for informed and engaged citizenship. And yet we have majorities and pluralities of students who say that they cannot have a frank and candid conversation on their campus about a whole host of the most important issues. Now let me see, I wanted to read the numbers here. Well, I can't, I'll get to it later. I've got too many backup documents here, but the number one issue about which students say they cannot have a frank conversation is, not surprisingly, Israel, Gaza. That's 53% in overall nationwide. And yet, in addition to that, there are 21 universities where 75% of the students say that they cannot have a free and frank conversation about that topic. And at Barnard College, which came out number 257 of 257, 90% of students say that. But I think we're not surprised by that, but under that, the next most important, the next issue that received the highest number of students who said they couldn't have a frank conversation, and it was something like 40%. I'm operating by memory here, but I've read the numbers quite a few times, so I think my memory's good. That 42% say they cannot have a frank conversation, candid conversation about abortion. The next presidential election, almost 40% of students say they cannot have a frank and candid conversation. How is that for the future of democracy? And there are many, many other examples, but let me tell you, the one that is the most dispiriting to me as a free speech crusader is 27% of students say they cannot candidly discuss the issue of hate speech, and 20% say they cannot candidly discuss free speech. So, we have no free speech about free speech because that is considered to be so controversial. And you put that together with the election being so controversial, not to mention many other public policy issues, that is a very, very serious problem. I'm not going to give you, I could give you many other examples of the assaults. Let me just say that so much attention has been paid to the Trump administration, and I do think that its assaults are so extensive in scope that even though I'm very, I always make a point to say, in some ways echoing a theme that Sue stressed, that this is not unique. We have constantly seen attacks on higher education. We've constantly seen attacks on freedom of speech from all administrations in my lifetime. I can attest to that. But this is so extraordinary in its breadth and its scope that it really is truly different in kind. It's a difference in degree that becomes different in kind. Part of the positive news is that the lawsuits, positive news is that the attacks by the Trump administration are so egregiously illegal, violating everything from administrative procedures to statutory standards to constitutional rights, all of the above, that their track record in the court is abysmal. The administration is losing virtually all of the cases that have been brought on First Amendment grounds, including most of the measures that have been addressed to universities. The most recent example, which got quite a bit of publicity, but it was fairly typical, was the ruling from Judge Burroughs in the federal court in Massachusetts last week, ruling in favor of both Harvard challenges to the Trump administration's defunding. So litigation is, and I hasten to add that so-called Trump judges are also consistently ruling against the Trump measures. So the courts are pretty much living up to their responsibility, despite an enormous amount of pressure, including threats of violence. I have friends who are federal judges, and they're understandably terrified. I don't know if how beyond the legal profession, how much publicity is given to the fact that judges are routinely receiving phone calls and emails with supposed pizza deliveries, and that's an allusion to a ruse that was used to murder the son of a federal judge in New Jersey a couple of years ago. But they are showing enormous courage as well as fidelity to the Constitution and other laws. And it's sad to have to say that, right, that it really does now take physical courage as well as moral courage to stand up to the bullying and threats that have been unleashed. I do have to acknowledge, though, that there is a limit to what can be accomplished through litigation. There's an old saying that the wheels of justice grind slowly, and it's hard to wait for that process to work its way through, while in the meantime you are facing enormous cuts to your budgets, you're facing enormous chilling impacts on students, international students as well as domestic students, and therefore there is a reasonable pressure to try to engage in some kind of settlement with the administration. I have many friends and colleagues who are highly critical of Columbia and others, and they say Columbia capitulated, and I understand the frustration, but I also am not harshly judgmental, because if you are facing what is truly an existential threat to your being able to continue to carry out your function, it is not at all irrational or unprincipled, in my view, to try to reach some kind of accommodation. That said, I doubt that the accommodation is actually going to stop the ongoing assaults from an administration that really does seem bent on destroying universities. I was going to give yet another category. So I've talked about a couple major kinds of threats, internal from the universities themselves, which have not been doing a good job in living up to their truth-seeking mission. The Trump administration, but let me also mention state governments. We saw so many attacks on universities long before Trump became president. DeSantis was probably the best known example, but this is going on in states across the South. One of the most recent attacks was yesterday. It got quite a bit of publicity today at Texas A&M, where under pressure from state Republican officials, the president of Texas A&M, after having said that he would never punish a faculty member who was strongly criticized by a student because the student didn't like the fact that the professor said that they were exposed them to some reading that said, heaven forbid, there are more than two genders, and the student complained to the president, and the president said, well, what do you expect me to do? And he was being sarcastic. Fire the faculty member? And the student said, yes, that's what I expect you to do. And the president said, I'm never going to do that. And within a couple of hours, that's what he did. And he also fired the dean and the chair of the department. who had stood up for the faculty members. So some of you may have seen last week there was a survey that was released by the American Association of University Professors of faculty members throughout the South and Middle states, and they are so dispirited and so anxious. Maybe the demographics are in their favor, Missy, but the state legislatures and governors there are so hostile that something like 50% of them said that they're looking for jobs elsewhere and that they would not recommend to their students, to their colleagues to look for jobs there. Okay, there are so many specifics that I could go into in terms of some of the major types of attacks that we're seeing from the Trump administration, but I think that I would rather use the time for questions and answers. Rather than giving several examples, I'm just going to give you one, and then I'm going to end with the positive, which I really promised. One of the attacks from the Trump administration, not only on universities, but universities among other institutions, has, of course, been DEI. And I find that so super ironic, but completely characteristic, because as a longtime free speech advocate, I know that just about everybody is inconsistent in defending free speech. Most people do believe in freedom of speech for me, but not for thee. But the inconsistency here I find so completely galling, that Trump and Vance and others of their ilk what helped their rise to power was their attack on so-called woke progressives in the academy, and they were chastising the snowflake students, right, who complained about being made uncomfortable and who didn't want to hear divisive ideas, such as ideas that were coming from conservative speakers. And guess what? Trump comes into power and exactly the same concepts are marshaled in his executive orders, and before that, we saw it in the Stop Woke Act in Florida and many other state legislation. If you look at it, it actually uses exactly the same terminology that professors and teachers, so this involves not only K through 12, but also universities, may not teach anything about race or gender or other controversial and sensitive and important topics that makes anybody feel uncomfortable or that is divisive, without even seeing the irony of it. So I promised that I would end with something positive. One wit once said, who was coming to the end of a talk, said, I really wanted to end with something positive, but I can't think of anything positive. Would you settle for 2 negatives? That's not what, I'm not going to pull that trick. In my crusading for free speech, I have found it very frustrating until quite recently to make the case, especially to people on the left end of the political spectrum, especially on campus where their views are in the ascendant. And to this day, I just did a podcast before coming here. The question is, but isn't free speech something that mostly protects conservatives, and it's conservatives who are always complaining about it, and it's only conservatives who are being censored, so why should we care about it? I mean, one thing we have to thank Trump and DeSantis for is if you still have that attitude, you are not paying attention, because it is the liberal and progressive faculty members and students, including this example at Texas A&M. But far beyond that, I think this started in particular after October 7th, under the Biden administration as well. And if I have time, I'll explain in question and answer. I'm happy to explain how some of Trump's tactics were actually pioneered by Biden and even Obama. So it's to some extent a bipartisan problem. But starting shortly after October 7th, we started to see disproportionate, or let's just say excessive, silencing and punishment of pro-Palestinian advocacy, which does tend to come from the left end of the political spectrum. So, and I've seen it at Columbia where my husband teaches, and we live right around the corner from campus, that so many of the faculty members there who were so hostile to free speech and so supportive of censorship of what they called hate speech completely turned around 180 degrees when their favored advocacy is being attacked as hate speech, and suddenly they understand, oh, it's not such a good idea to give government or universities power to punish hate speech. So the silver lining to the cloud of people understanding how dangerous censorship and the other attacks on civil liberties and the rule of law is that there truly has been a real galvanizing. The AAUP and faculty have at many universities have formed new academic freedom groups. Students are doing the same. So thanks to the extraordinary external pressures, I really have hope for a nurturing and a flourishing of a more robust movement for internal, voluntary, constructive reform by the universities themselves.
Thank you. There's so many different ways we could go with this, and I've got a thought that if any of you, all of you would like to play around with, and if not, pick something else, take it away. But one thing that's sort of general semantic-y would be to, as you said, to think about the language of some of this, and in particular, I've been thinking a lot lately about, well, levels of abstraction and definitions, and how we broadly sometimes think we agree when we're using very high-level abstractions, but then when you get into the details of what you mean by those terms, you discover, oh, wait, no, you don't see this, no, not at all. And in particular, what I'm thinking about, a specific example, is less in my life as an academic and more in my life as a parent, where I'm on the Facebook groups for the parents of several different universities, ones that my kids have one of them is here, have gone to. And some of these schools are places where there were encampments and just a lot of stuff going on. And I never comment on these, I don't get into it, but just watching the parents' comments that can get us thinking, got me thinking about how people define what is education, what is college, what is learning, because some of the parents, in the height of some of these issues, and not just encampments, but like last year, my son is at Tufts. There was a student who was basically abducted off the street. You may remember that story. Parents start to post all kinds of things, and argue with each other. And a lot of them would post things like, college isn't for demonstrating, college isn't for protesting, college is for learning. Our kids are there to learn. And it does raise that question of, well, what is learning then? Or what is college learn? What is liberal arts education? Or I've always thought of education as something much more than what happens in any of my classrooms, for sure. Anyhow, I could go on and I'll stop, but anybody want to play with that at all?
So I'll just start because I started picking on our compression of definitions at the start of this. But I have to just say one thing first, just one thing. That demographic data that I told you about, I want you to understand that I believe that is why Vance and Trump are so extreme. This is, in reality, the white folk, particularly rich white folk, are going to be outnumbered soon. And they're clawing to their power. I want to say that because this is just strategy. I don't think they give a damn about us. It's just strategic to stay in power. But that being said, let's talk about education. So when we do the things that I described, particularly around AP and then aligning all the curriculum for transfer, we start getting in a habit of getting through education rather than getting in education. And so I'm not surprised that nobody feels they can talk about anything on campus. They don't know how. All right? There hasn't been enough time to work on that. I would get students transferring in 15 credits from high school, another 15 from the in high school community college experience, and then they're in their upper level bio class, right? They didn't learn the part where you actually deal with tough issues. And I do think that that is one of our functions. I think that we need to learn how to talk with each other about hard things, and that's one of the few places we can do that is in education. But if we've compressed what we do to get things done, to save people money, to get them through, then we don't actually build the time for that. And I'm not saying that you can't do that in an AP class, and I'm not saying you can't do that in a community college class. I've actually taught all of these classes, right, where we do it. But I don't think it's the main mode of operation at this point. It's speed, cheaper, faster. How do we do it without costing too much money?
I want to react to a couple of things. I can lean over. It's okay.
I think that's all we got.
One issue I think has to do with this question of the inability to have a conversation, to understand that historically the university was a space that provided an opportunity for debate. The idea that education provides an environment where people feel safe is antithetical to what I understood education was about. My understanding of going to a university was that I was supposed to be exposed to things that I didn't feel comfortable with. That I was supposed to feel challenged. I was supposed to be exposed to things that I was unaccustomed to. And students today are being told, or we're getting them at higher education, going through programs that do just the opposite. That they make them feel comfortable, and that's part of the rhetoric coming out of the administration today. You know, nothing that's supposed to feel discomfort about our past. You know, oh, don't mention slavery, by the way. You know, that type of thing. That's different than my understanding of what higher education is supposed to be. I actually, and I don't like trigger warnings, but I actually, I start my classes with trigger warnings now, in no small part because just a couple of years ago, to go from the residential side of my campus to the educational side of campus, there were signs, and actually, you know, like where you see these things that warn you that there's, you know, slippery when wet. Well, they would use those and say, trigger warning, you may be exposed to ideas that are uncomfortable to you. That I find very disturbing. I think that is something that we need to understand about higher education, or education in general, that has been turned away from, diminished, and this close to being criminalized by the current administration. The other issue that I think we need to talk about is the idea of language, of what's happening to control of language. The administration wants to control language. They will limit press access based on what you call the Gulf of whatever. There is the surreptitious use of coded language. You know, make America great again. That's, you know, coded language. Make America healthy again. You know, it's coded language. Urban is a coded term. Peggy mentioned, you know, my heart is in urban communication, and being a member of the Urban Communication Foundation, we look at what the association with the word urban means, and it's being associated with violence. It's being associated with minorities. It's like, oh, that's black, that's brown people that live in cities. And you know, we need to control cities, and that's what we're seeing on the streets of the country right now. You know, we're seeing the militarization of our cities. That, I would argue, is related to the use of, or the power of the language associated with urban. Part of what is going on also is changing the use of our language within educational environments. So programs for DEI, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion has become a dirty word, you know, dirty words now. We have an executive order that bans the use of those, that punishes educational environments that use those terms or have programs that promote those terms. Gender identity is another one. Climate chaos or crisis. But the use of language has been very, very strategic and very effective. And I see it at play in society at large and in the university setting in particular, when I see people losing grants because they use the word DEI, you know, words that reflect DEI and the like.
Right, but the problem there, and I want to make sure Nadine has it next thing, but I want to just say the problem there is that the grant structure 5-10 years ago required everybody to put that in, and that was another kind of use of language to do it, right? I'm not going to argue against working towards a better, more inclusive environment, but I am also not going to pretend that in many places that language was used on campus to stop conversation, right? So it's not just what Trump's doing with it now, which is an opportunistic way to turn us on ourselves. That is what that is. But at the same time, on our campuses, I will tell you that when George Floyd moment happened on my little campus, right, we had moments, we had conversations, we had protests, and then we had a committee formed to deal with racial equity. I can't remember what they called themselves. They formed themselves separate from the infrastructure that we had for inclusion and equity and access to grants and all of the things that sort of HRE approaches. And what happened was, after a single year, the committee made it so that nobody of color wanted to be involved. Okay? So it can be just as dogmatic from all directions. We have to be honest about that, right? That being said, you can't erase what the underlying thing is we are a diverse community that needs to understand each other and listen to each other and recognize barriers to success that we are setting up and undo that. I agree with all of that stuff, but I don't want to pretend that that was like a fully easy movement. That's all. And all of those grants had that in there because we then legislated that they had to be in there, and then we took them away. Sorry, Nadine, I'm sorry.
Don't be sorry. Well, I want to answer the specific question that we got from Peggy about, which I took to be our protest part of the educational process, you know, having, I want to see everybody in the audience all stand up. Being a proud student of the 60s and 70s, protest was a big part of my education. And I, you know, former head of the ACLU, I believe very strongly and passionately in the importance of peaceful, non-disruptive protest, which throughout our history has been the major way that human rights and social justice has been advanced. That's what ultimately led to the constitutional amendments or the statutes that brought the abolition of slavery and workers' rights and women's suffrage and on and on and on. How does it fit into a college education? To me, it has to be complementary to other educational undertakings, and one of the things that I find particularly frustrating looking at what's going on at Columbia right around the corner for me and many other campuses is that the only quote education or exchange about this incredibly complicated situation in the Middle East is warring groups of students shouting slogans at each other without even knowing what the slogans mean, as investigators have documented. So, one of my friends who's very involved in all of these issues and, a classical liberal guy who believes in dialogue and exchange and so forth, his son is applying to college now, and he said, given how expensive college is, we're not going to pay money for a campus where the only discussion you have on these issues is something that you could get for free by going to a public park and participating in a protest. And yet, you can count on the fingers of one hand the universities and colleges in this country that have had serious academic programs, courses, what we used to in the Vietnam era called teach-ins, where you use this as a learning opportunity to get actual information. So I certainly defend the protest, but they have crowded out on some campuses more learned exchanges. And not because of lack of student hunger. Students are showing that when they're given the opportunity to respond to anonymously, they will acknowledge that they are ignorant and they really don't know what the issues are, and they really wish they could find out, but they don't want to admit that. They have to perform that they really know what it is that has led them to whichever group that they have aligned themselves with. On the issue of language here, to tie into the general semantics theme, I want to say that for many, many decades, the single biggest threat to free speech on campus, tying into this expansive notion of safety, as meaning safety from ideas that I find distressing or insulting, has been an overly expansive concept of harassment, as hostile environment harassment, that has now devolved into the concept that anytime somebody says anything that somebody finds insulting and insults some aspect of my identity, that is illegal harassment. And unfortunately, the Obama administration began the trend of folding that completely illegal and unconstitutional concept into the civil rights laws, starting with Title IX, and an overbroad definition of hostile environment sexual harassment as anything that anybody says or implies that has any sexual or gender connotation that somebody finds insulting or demeaning. And that is exactly the concept that was then adopted first by Biden after October 7th, and subsequently with an even greater vengeance by Donald Trump in enforcing Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race and national origin, and it extends to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And so they have been treating as illegal, hostile environment harassment any criticism of Israel that a Jewish student says makes her uncomfortable, or any criticism of Hamas that a Muslim student says makes them uncomfortable. And we've got to, the Supreme Court ruled on this many years ago in a case that makes clear that this is all unconstitutional, but the Constitution is not self-enforcing. And I would say the single greatest improvement we could make to creating a genuine free speech climate on our campus is to make students understand that the fact that they feel uncomfortable or insulted or offended does not give them a legal right to shut down the person who said that they should see this as an opportunity to expand their understanding of what other people's perspectives are, to develop their resilience against ideas that they find hurtful, and hopefully this will be a model for a more robust and civil discourse at a more general societal and political level as well.
I'm just having a little thought that I'll throw in too, which is that to back up to protests, students and protests, and anyone who grew up in a time where it was something that happened on campuses and didn't seem like such a problem. More of a media ecological perspective. This would be, I need to think hard about this, but to play with it a little bit. I wonder if part of what's happening also, when I think about students, I think about people who aren't very good at things yet, because you're not supposed to be, right? To learn how to do something, you have to practice it and do it badly over and over and over again until you get a little better at it. And something like a student protest is like that, right? And so and so they're not going to do it well at first. They're going to say kind of stupid things or rude things. You know, they're just not, you have to help them learn how to do it. And I wonder if right now with digital media, social media, if universities are just so terrified of the publicity. You know, of course there were newspapers and there was television, and so when things happened on college campuses, you could find out about it. But I feel like it's so fast and so unfiltered and so strange when students are recording it as it's happening and posting something out of context, and then schools are terrified that now no one's going to apply next year. We're not going to get a new freshman class. It's all interrelated, right? And just so messy. I feel like we should let you all ask some questions, and I see Michael's hand up first and Tom's up second.
So first of all, thank you very much for these presentations. Really illuminating from your perspectives. So thank you for that. I'm wondering if you would like to comment on what we're seeing today as a result of a conflict of strategies. And the strategies that tend to be used by education, higher education, and by democracy itself is consensus. But it's another strategy that I would argue is first applied by business negotiations, then labor negotiations, and now I would argue by the Trump administration, is one of brinksmanship. And so this idea of arguing the most extreme position to see how much you can get without being pushed back. And I'm wondering if that conflict of strategies is at the heart of where we're seeing all of these challenges to not only higher education, but democratic institutions.
Anybody?
Good point. That's a really interesting direction to go. I have to really give it some thought. I mean, part of my reaction to that is it also relates to kind of the business model of higher education now, which I think is broken or antiquated, and that bringing in that approach from a business world may very well be something new and perhaps welcome at higher education institutions. Because I think part of what we're seeing right now, in addition to the internal issues of demographics, the financial exigencies that are leading to greater percentages of untenured adjunct faculty, basically threats to tenure. That what we're talking about is a new business model for education, and brinksmanship may very well become part of that.
I'll just say it's a very interesting point. Wearing my hat as a lawyer, it has legal significance. And one of the grounds in which the court ruled in the Harvard cases was that these extortionate tactics are coercive, and the Constitution's guarantee of free speech is violated not only by outright criminal prosecution or outright gag orders, prior restraints, but also by coercive tactics that, as a practical matter, leave no choice. And I think that's a very common sense, functional definition of freedom of speech. If you are so likely to be chilled because of these tactics, the threats, that should be as unconstitutional as more outright prohibitioning measures.
Tom was
By the
next.
way, you mentioned the Harvard decision. If anybody hasn't read it, 84 pages, Judge Burroughs, read it. That would be the silver lining. That's the more positive message tonight.
Okay, wait, Tom, hold a second, because Terry wants to respond to Michael, and then Tom.
Yeah, what I was thinking when you were speaking, you were using the word strategy. And I was thinking, we're really talking about values. They translate into strategy, but you first have to say what is, and I think the idea that all business people are just out, they are all Donald Trumps, that they just want to be cutthroat, they don't read poetry or philosophy, they don't know how to have any consensus among them. The best business people know how to cooperate and compromise. And so I think that we, of all people, need not to use these kinds of, and of course I do agree that I don't like the idea of a business model for education. And I think the purpose of education is to teach people how to think. And so, and it needs to start, I think, much lower down. I'm thinking I was like a toddler when Richard Nixon was running against Adlai Stevenson or whatever, and I remember hearing this term, egghead. So now when you're 2 or 3 years old or 5, whatever I was, what in the world are they talking about? And then my parents explained to me that an egghead is somebody who thinks. And I never recovered from that. What's wrong with thinking? So I think I agree with what you're saying, but it starts with values, and those values translate into strategies that are positive or negative.
Okay, so I don't mean to be a hog, but I have 2 questions, one kind of long one and then one really short one for maybe.
Louder.
Okay, louder. So when I was an undergraduate student, getting a bachelor's degree was 128 credits. No, I'm sorry, I'm talking to the panelists. And now it's 120 credits, and the New England Commission on Higher Education, which is the accrediting body north of us here in the Middle States, started talking last year about a 90-credit bachelor's degree. And in Minnesota, I don't know if it's the education department itself, but a number of the institutions in Minnesota are talking about the same thing. They're not talking about the European model where you'll get 3 years of a bachelor's degree and the 4th year is your master's. That's not what they're talking about. So I want to know what the panelists think about the rumblings that are going on with respect to this. Nadine, my quick question to you is, it was really great to hear you speak positively about the judges dealing with the litigation from the Trump administration, except that you left out one branch, which is the Supreme Court. So I was just wondering how you would add them to, if you could add them to your positive spin on things going on.
Would you guys want to take the hardest?
So, Tom, the debate that's going on about the 90 credit degree has been going on for some time. There was a pilot study, actually, that NECHI was part of and rejected the first time around. But what they came to is a different name for that degree. Okay? And it's going to be basically a professionally oriented degree. Okay? And as opposed to a Bachelor of Arts. Now remember that in the model that you said it isn't, remember that when they go on for the 4th year, it's called honors there, all right, in Europe, right? So they really are trying to grapple with this. Now, of course, it makes a more focused, the gen ed will be they're not talking about making the gen ed smaller, but they are talking about making electives disappear. I want to be thoughtful about that degree. Now, in the wrong hands, of course, it's going to be part of this same factory model that I'm describing with all the other compression. But I also want to understand that there are ways to design that with good education and debate, good education. There's still a robust gen ed that could be made meaningful. But it is, in fact, a faster model. People don't understand what those extra, and I lived through this literally as my first week as provost, when a student came in who had everything done, her major credits, her gen ed, everything, and still needed 30 credits. And she said, so this is just a cash thing. So, you know, I mean, we all want this idea of the one that we love, but there may be room for that one, but the only way for that one to be any good is to actually design it appropriately with the thinking still in it.
Right.
My immediate reaction, it's money.
Right.
And more, the decisions that we're coping with are based on the bottom dollar. And whether it's what I was talking about before, threats to tenure, adjunct faculty, or, you know, all of the things that we're dealing with, unfortunately, I think it comes down increasingly to money. And being accountable to students who view higher education, view their professors in some situations as their employees. I mean, I've literally had students say to me, I pay your salary. You know, and I'm supposed to change your life, you know. But they see us as their employees. And so this is this changing psychology as the dollars go up and up and up in terms of tuition, that I think also is shaping the academy right now. And I think that the appeal of 90 credits, if you count how many dollars you pay per credit, you know, I think you know, a big part of it comes down to something as simple as that.
I think it is money, but it's not just money for the university, it's money for the student.
Yes.
Right. And when they come from a high school experience where they came with credits already, it's just this kind of, but I'll come back to my observation about the mush, right? I believe in actually very differentiated opportunities, but everybody should be allowed to be in them. Like, we got to stop the segregation that happens in the first place, which starts way back in the kindergarten years, right? But being clear about what each of them is also important, because we have had, when we went through the community college reform in Connecticut, which is still a mess, but some things are better, okay? There were 90 credit associate's degrees. That's insane too, okay? So we have to be real about what levels mean and what we think can happen at each of these. So I'm not going to just badmouth the 90 credit degree, but I am going to say we better get clear about what we think each purpose is.
So your question, Tom, actually ties back to something a point that I made to Michael. I was thinking of a very recent Supreme Court case from 2 years ago, which illustrates the fact that for all of the disagreement on this court on civil liberties and constitutional law issues in general, they have been remarkably consistent and protective of free speech in particular. I'm less confident when we talk about some of the other types of violations that are being committed by the Trump administration. But on these free speech issues, I think we can count on the votes of at least a majority, if not a supermajority. So let me tell you about the case from a couple of years ago, because it came from New York. It was unanimous. It was a case I'm very proud that the National ACLU handled in the Supreme Court, despite a huge amount of pushback from our members, including here in New York. And I'm going to make the point again that people tend to not understand the underlying principle. They're just looking at who the speaker and the message is in a particular case without understanding how it can come back to bite them or come back to help them very quickly. So let me just, bear with me. The particular entity whose free speech rights the ACLU came to the defense of against government coercion was the NRA, the National Rifle Association, deeply unpopular with ACLU members, to the extent that even a couple of state-based affiliates of the ACLU disaffiliated from the ACLU over this case, including the one right here in New York, which is where the case came from. It came from the Cuomo administration, an administrator named Maria Volo, who had authority over banking and insurance, and basically put pressure on the regulated entities, the banking and financial companies, and said, do not do business with the NRA, or if you do business with them, we're going to impose regulations on you. We're not going to, give you business. We're going to make your life miserable. But it wasn't an outright, legal action. It was what we often call jawboning, implicit threats. And the ACLU, the National ACLU, was trying to explain, and I personally was in many conversations with some of our mutual friends, Missy, explaining, but wait, if the Cuomo administration can do this to the NRA, don't you get that the DeSantis administration can do it to, a pro-gun control organization, or to the ACLU, or to Planned Parenthood? No, but that is the 9-0 precedent that has been the key precedent, as you saw, in the university cases and also in the law firm cases. So it is one area where I'm absolutely confident that we have the Supreme Court on our side.
There's the positive. Others? Yes. Here.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm a student, a fresh grad student. Amen.
Why don't you stand up, Sue?
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you guys for being here. This was really enlightening to hear. My question, and bear with me when I ask this, because I'm a recent undergrad graduate, and a lot of the issues that you guys are bringing up, I literally watch in real time occur, and especially the part of threats to freedom of speech. But the question I want to ask for you guys is, what is because I hear a lot of the functionality or the questioning of what is the functionality of education, or specifically higher education in people's lives. Someone said social mobility. But when your educational system becomes a factory for corporations, what is the functionality of, in your opinion, the professor? Because a lot of times the professor is the one who dictates the classroom, how the conversation will flourish, will flow, and all of that. But more importantly, how I guess we students show up. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out, as someone who wants to be a future professor, what is that type of what is our functionality in that space? Is it authoritarian? Is it dictatorial? Like that is a wrong thing that we won't tolerate in terms of being in here, or in terms of like ideas, and also like how does your personal self show up in the classroom as well? I hope that made sense.
There's lots of good.
No, she's actually the first professor that's been good at like showing up in the classroom. Like sorry, but like undergrad was not it.
Anybody? You're sure? I just don't want to go first.
Well, I'll take it because I'm still in the classroom.
There you go.
I faced a group of undergraduates for the first time on Tuesday, and I kind of asked myself a similar question, like, what am I supposed to be giving you? And I found myself saying, my job is to make you think. I feel as if my job is to drop a bomb. And I don't know what effect it's going to have, but I need to make you feel uncomfortable. I need to introduce you to things that you haven't been introduced to before. I need to make you think in ways you haven't thought of before. And then you decide where you go. But my job is to shake you up. And one of the problems that I've had that's a little different than your question, so I mean, to answer your question, it's, yeah, I want to shake you up, do what you'll do with what I give you. But what I'm going to give you is going to make you uncomfortable and make you think about things you haven't thought about before. And if I haven't done that, then I'm guilty of educational malpractice. And I don't think there's insurance for that, so I have to be careful. But the other part of that issue is, what's the role of a professor? What do I owe my students? And I've asked myself that a lot lately, because of the issue of self-censorship. That I have felt a pressure to self-censor more. I've been at my university for 36 years, and this semester, more than any other semester, I realize I'm guarding what I say. And so the idea, the power, and I teach media law and freedom of expression. And, you know, this is at the heart of what I do and what I write and what I advocate for and what I've been an activist for. And the idea that I am feeling a chill the way I feel right now is something that I'm grappling with, and I think that my colleagues need to face up to. That's the environment that we're in right now. And so I don't even know if I can play that role that I just described to you. I say to I said to my students on Tuesday, you know, my job title is professor. I'm going to profess. You don't have to agree with me. Your grade isn't based on agreeing with me. Your grade is based on whether you think critically and whether you can back up the assertions that you make. And I realize that there are topics that I feel a chill about. Just before I came here tonight, I was putting together a PowerPoint for tomorrow, and I start every class with a news item. And I realized that when I went to put together a slide about the number of journalists that in the last month have been killed in Gaza, I didn't know quite how to frame that slide or whether I should even use that slide. If I had to think twice about that in a class of graduate students in journalism, that's bad. That's a chilling effect. And I'm quite upset that happened today. So I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah.
Can I just throw in a thought? It's not directly related, or I'm not necessarily sure how this is related, but you're reminding me of last year in particular, toward the end of the year, I got a request that I get all the time, especially when I was department chair. We have a school paper. I'm at Adelphi University. The Delphian is the school paper. I'm in the communications department. And so anytime a Delphian reporter would contact me to say, could we get a quote from you about something that you know something about, I always say yes, because I want to say yes. I want to be helpful, you know. And I know they need people to say yes. And there was one, I know, in January we've got budget issues like everybody, and there was this massive layoff the day before classes started. And nobody would talk to the Delphian. You know, the students couldn't get anybody to go on the record with any kind of comment about any of it, you know, and so they came to me, would you give a quote? And I can't remember honestly if it ended up in their reporting or not, it doesn't matter. But I was so much more careful about, okay, how am I going to craft this? Like, what am I going to say? You know, and not because there's any, no, got an adjunct in my department in the back there. Anyway, you know, just like, what should I say about this so that it's real and accurate and honest, but not too controversial? Like, where do I want to go with it? And I think that's sort of how it feels in the classroom as well now. Just a little bit of not quite sure how to do things that we used to not think twice about.
But think about it. You're a tenured professor.
Right.
I'm a tenured professor. What are the untenured going through?
Right.
What are the adjuncts going through?
Right.
Where is the free expression there? Where is the chilling effect that's being experienced there?
when, like at A&M, where not only did an instructor get fired, but the chair and the dean, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nadine, but last year I was teaching a class more on free speech and campus conversations and conflicts, and so we looked at a lot of those fire ratings, and wasn't A&M very highly rated by fire as like a great place? No, okay.
Terrible
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not relieved, but I'm relieved that they didn't turn bad so fast, like from last year to this year. Okay.
So I'm going to, just because we've had a really good answer from a person in the classroom, I'm going to speak about what I tried to do when I was in administration, because things come up, especially in election years. And so more than once, I had a group of students show up my door when I was the dean and say, that faculty member is biased the way they're teaching this thing. And I would say, okay, talk to me about it. And I would actually call the faculty member and say, okay, how do we address this? Because I didn't want them to feel sunk, but I didn't want the students to not feel heard, right? Now, that is a hard needle to thread. Because when a dean calls a faculty member, they're already scared, right? And so I would have to say, hey, listen, this is going on. I think that there's just confusion about how to have a good conversation, but let's do that. And usually I was able to resolve it, but not always, you know, with the students actually having a conversation with the faculty member and it being there. So I recognize how much self-censorship must be going on because of that worry, right? Because the students were feeling perfectly empowered to go say, hey, I don't want to have that conversation. Now, I will say that often I would have the exact opposite accusation about the same professor, right? They're too liberal or they're too, and I would say to the professor, clearly you're doing it right, but we got to figure out what these students are making of this situation, right? So I think it's really hard. I think that it's really important for students to feel like they can say things, that they can meaningfully contribute to the conversation and not be shot down. It's important to understand that faculty actually have some expertise that should be relied on and in there, but also understand that everybody's kind of in a little bit of a hotbed. Because even if we are not in this most hostile moment, and this is an extremely hostile moment, but even before this, there is a sense of, if I want to have an open relationship with my students, I have to let these things flow. But sometimes it's going to be uncomfortable. And how do we get there? I mean, I got questioned about a comment I made when I was a tenure track faculty member that showed up on a teaching evaluation. So the dean said, what does that mean? And I said, I have no idea. You know, so it's kind of an interesting thing. So we're always juggling, and I think most people are trying to juggle how to do that. You know, there may be some faculty that just don't care what you think. I don't know. But it's not my general experience. Right? But I do think everybody's kind of a little bit of a, I don't know how to deal with this right now. I think that's real.
Yeah, it's and the threats are coming from so many different directions.
Hang on.
Thank you. A phrase I saw when I was reading the article about Texas A&M was ambush by video. Everybody is afraid, rationally so, that anything they say can be taken out of context and go viral and then become a basis, you know, in the setup that there are some students that are clearly out to get certain faculty members, and they're still coming from all over the ideological spectrum. But recognizing, so I think we all agree on what a professor should do, and if I can just underscore that, it goes back to the 1915 Declaration of the American Association of University Professors about academic freedom and academic responsibility. Professors have academic freedom, their expertise is respected, but they have a responsibility to educate and not to indoctrinate, to teach students how to think, not what to think. and I think that is universally accepted as our mission. But it is, as a practical reality, becoming harder and harder to live up to that. And one of the organizations I work with is called the Heterodox Academy, which has been working constructively with universities and faculty and students to promote measures and steps that will overcome this whole cluster of problems that we're talking about. Getting students to listen, getting them to engage in civil discourse, getting them not to complain, immediately look for biased complaints. And one of the strategies, which I actually started to use before I stopped teaching way back in 2019, is to have an agreement among your students before the class starts. And you can make a proposal. These will be the terms on which we will have discussions. And one point that's very common is no view is off limits, and students may not say that any view is off limits, and they may not even eye roll. You have nonverbal expressions that convey that. Every statement has to have some evidence to support it, some authority to support it, or some reason to support it. It may not be simply conclusory. It may not be based simply on your subjective personal experience. And there are many, many models that you can see. And then there are agreements about what will happen if somebody transgresses one of those norms. And I've talked to a lot of faculty members who have used that kind of approach, and I think even the process of adopting those rules of engagement for the classroom is itself a very valuable educational experience, and then everybody has buy-in. And it ties into that notion that the professor is not a dictator. The professor is somebody who is helping guide the students to exercise their thinking and their autonomy to decide what kind of classroom experience they want to have.
Anybody else?
Yes. The issue of that you brought up in terms of how what we're going through now, a lot of this is driven by domination of white, or the white replacement theory and things like this, that larger arch. I have an interesting background. I was born in 57, but my father was 1st Marine Division Chosen in Korea. He went on to education. He was in vocation, working with his hands, but he also got 3 college degrees. Ended up as the first certified industrial commissioner of Brookhaven in New York State. Industrial commissioner of Brookhaven Town, the largest township in New York. I grew up, when in 61, we moved to the island. And I was going with my father into the city because he was a member of the NAACP. And he told my brother and myself that, why? Because when he fought in Korea, all our blood is the same. Now, we're looking forward to maybe colonizing Mars and all this. How come we don't how come it's not taught in universities on a scale that gives us the ability to really look at human genetic diversity in the true sense? We go back 100,000 years, mass extinction, probably less than 10,000 human pairs of modern humans breeding. And when I often use this as an example, you open a window, and the houseflies that come in through your window in the summer have more genetic diversity than the humans in this room, humans in Manhattan. And it's never put into that context. We don't talk about
Us being all the same.
This celebration of humanity in terms of this genetic place in the timeline.
Yeah.
So, and I don't,
So I don't know why that isn't part of what we teach, but I do think it is different from what I'm describing, right? When I talk about this group of people, and this group of people is, let me be clear, I think we're talking about very wealthy white men. We're not even talking about, it's a small group that wants to keep all the cookies. And they're manipulating all sorts of perfectly nice other people, right? Who might happen to be white. I don't know, whatever. But the conversations about our sameness are I think conversations that many people who teach communication, not biology, right, actually do talk about. Right? We talk about it in cultural impact, in cultural engagement, and how we construct interaction with each other. We also talk about difference, but we talk about difference in terms of this is in a continuum of interactions where humans are trying to figure out what we're doing, right? That is part of some of the stuff that we do in this field. It's also something that psychologists do and sociologists and anthropologists. So it's not just biology, but biology is an interesting component, right? It's a really interesting one. I just think that the moment we're talking about has nothing to do with that. It's a manipulative power grab from a small group of people, right? And they're using that replacement theory to manipulate a whole bunch of people that don't even believe that nonsense, right? Because they're doing the it's mine, it's yours, now they're calling you this, and it's like, it's great propaganda. I mean, it's, where's a rule when we need it, right?
Well,
You know?
realistically, it's us versus them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great, it's horrifying. I say great in the most awful term. So I think if I go back to what Mike asked, but maybe rephrase it, right? It's not about, yeah, I'm sorry. It's not about a rational answer. Because if we're arguing rationality to that line of reasoning, we're going to lose because it is bullying and blustering and power grab. We're going to actually have to unite and say no. I don't see any other way out of this. Now, I thank goodness for the activism that's going on, whether on the scale that Nadine can do it, because she is a wonderful speaker and people are listening and she's organizing, or on the scale that you're doing it in your classrooms, or on the scale that we're doing it in our communities. You know, I'm not trying to brag at all. I'm just saying one little board that I'm on is making sure that our calendar of offerings makes sure that we are giving voice to really tough political questions, right, in the list of things that we're offering next year. So it's all of those things to just say no, but it also means saying no and continuing to engage with people, right? Not staying in our little happy cocoons of people we agree with. And that's hard work. I don't see how else we do it. You know, and I'm going way beyond the university now because I'm not even there anymore, right? I retired. It's in my mind every day. I still read the Chronicle every day. I watch that list of things every day. But in reality, I'm dealing with neighbors, right? And we have to really think about it that way, because this is, I mean, I can make all of the fun snide comments and jokes I want to make. In reality, it's very disturbing. I wake up every morning, I open the news, my husband opens the news, he starts making a face, I say, oh my God, what? Maybe I can talk to the grandbaby, that'll be better. You know, but you can't. You got to make the world better for the grandbaby.
Yeah.
Right.
One more? And with a student?
Yeah, hello, I'm here with the graduate class here. I really resonated when we talked about some schools that are undergoing the change between a college to a university. I went to one of those schools, I graduated a few years ago, that I went to Manhattan College, that is now Manhattan University. I think I was the last graduating class to be MC. We're now NU. And I have a lot of pride in my alma mater. I really had an excellent liberal arts experience there, and I totally resonate with I work in corporate America, I work in the media industry, and I really, really defend a liberal arts education, even if you're going to work in marketing or business. I think it's really important that you're taught to think in complex ways, even if you have a monotonous kind of job, because those kinds of brains make those, I mean, I know, but it's true, we can't all be robots, we can't all have these super transactional degrees, have super transactional jobs. I think it's really valuable no matter what you want to do. I don't mean to sound obnoxious and I want to ask what's the solution, but what would you say, what would be your suggestion to a school like Manhattan University or Marist University, where you're on the smaller, less funded end of a a liberal arts community, and like Manhattan, I call it Manhattan College, like just out of like tendency, but like Manhattan College, like has a pride in, and is a great like marketing tactic, branding themselves as a school that they do churn out excellent like economic mobility. They have like a numerical rate of like a lot of first generation college students that go to Manhattan College and they graduate and they get they're like the first in their lineage to get a corporate job and like a high salary, and like that's not a not impressive and a not important thing.
It isn't.
But it also is, historically a liberal arts college, and I really want to see my alma mater preserve that value, but also they shouldn't like not celebrate that economic mobility that they have been churning for the past few years. What is your recommendation on like not just branding, but like because with turning becoming a university, they've also in the past couple of years gone through a lot of changes that I've been observing, and I agree with some, I don't agree with most, but they're kind of making that move towards, they want to be a liberal arts school, but they are leaning on the business and engineering degrees that are and have to be more transactional programs, and I get that. Like, what do you think? What is like what is like the general recommendation for a school like that? I know
No,
that's like
so, no,
broad. I know
let-
it's happy. I'm sorry, but
No,
like,
no. It's such a good question,
Yeah,
and there
okay.
isn't an answer.
Okay.
But
Okay,
I will
sorry.
give you a list of things that we need to be thinking about.
Okay.
So first of all, when you become a university, it doesn't mean you have to get rid of liberal arts, right?
Right.
It means you have to. But what Manhattan College, now university, is trying to do is survive.
Yes.
And they're trying to survive in that very context I described, which is the demographic problem,
Yeah.
right? So they're trying to compete. Now, almost how many schools in the room went to university? Well, several, right? A whole bunch went to that, and that's about a couple of things. One of which is international students, because in Europe, college means something different, right? How many schools expanded athletics to bring in? Marist did that years ago. WestCon did that. How many then added a component of engineering if they could get away with it, or at least CS to be more computer science, right? These are all and healthcare, health industries, right? These are the things that they're trying to compete with each other with, and that's the only strategy they have, right? Is that we have fewer students. Fordham's going to be okay because they're gigantic. They've been around for a long, long time. But Manhattan, Marist, when I started there, that was the first time I heard about the demographic thing. It was 2001. But other people were not talking about it for another 10 years. They were already strategizing. All you can do is decide who you're going to serve and be clear about it, and hope that will help you survive. But this growth model, which is what everybody's going on, is not going to make it. And you can see it, because the other thing that's in the Chronicle every day is the next closure of a small school, right? So I don't fault everybody for trying all the strategies. My bearer of bad news is you're not all going to make it, right? But my bearer of good news is I'm glad you asked the question. Because that's the question we need to be asking. What are we going to do? And I served students at the end of my career, right? I served students who were primarily first generation, increasingly diverse. We got named as an HSI. All of those things are true. We had very minimal admission standards because we put a lot of supports in to try to deal with that. So students from all backgrounds could have a shot at succeeding. But even as a state institution, they're cross-border tuition, trying to get the international student, whatever, because there's not enough funding there. So what actually has to happen is a different funding model for higher education. And that's, we can talk about our core values, but we need a funding model that's going to work.
The values just like by nature, like kind of have to take a backseat.
Well, I mean, you can choose, right? You can say, I'm going to be an engineering school, or I'm going to be a arts school and be small, right? I mean, be small, but that means you have to be smaller. because there's this many number of students. I keep talking, you know, to you actually, and I keep reading economics book looking for an answer. I feel like there must be a way to do this, but I think that the real answer is socialism, so I don't know, it's not going to work. Anyway, that's all I got.
Do you want to do a takeaway, each of you?
I mean, the only other response I would have, aside from the fact that there are people in this room who probably should answer that question.
There are 2 faculty members from Manhattan here.
But the idea of the value, I'm in a university where and we've been a university for a long time. We were a branch of NYU, and then we became a college, and then we became a university a long time ago. But I see that. I'm in a school of communication where the push is towards vocation. You're not supposed to use that word. I've been at meetings where, like, it was bloody because we use that word. Skills, another word that is a trigger. But part of what we've tried to do, and I'm usually not a cheerleader for my university, but part of what we've tried to do to maintain the importance of liberal arts is that in order to get a BA, it doesn't matter what program you're in. If you're in engineering, if you're in the School of Business, a little different, but there are even programs within the School of Business, School of Communication. If you want a BA, you still have to have, it's 94 credits of liberal arts. And that sets a tone. Even while speaking to what professions you can go into, there's still that mandate that the students are dealing with. So at the very same time as you're out there pitching on recruitment days to the parents about, and I hate this, the dog and pony show, but you go out there and you pitch, oh, it's this profession, it's that profession. In my case, it's pre-law. In my case, it's you can use a communication degree to get into law school, and you don't have to be poli-sci, you don't have to be history, And I've got my routine, but the bottom line is while the parents are being told you can go to law school, you can, go into media management, you can do this, you can do that. The students are living a life of 94 credits of liberal arts.
Right.
So it's still there in their lived experience.
Yeah, and so, like, I know Manhattan University, like, once they became universities, so many things changed. And one of those things was they condensed the liberal arts and science school, and therefore, with that, they kind of nixed some of those, like, core liberal arts, like, gen eds. So I think, like, they're kind of feels like a last resort. They're trying to keep that, those, like, the liberal arts first, and then, like, certification second, but the last big direction that they made was to, disperse that a little bit differently. So, I don't know, like, we'll see what the future holds.
It's a really, your question, I think, is a really important question.
Yeah, I mean, because I was at such an interesting time, like, I was a liberal arts student there. I was one of the last class that did 4 full years of, like, the previous liberal arts school. So, I was upset about it. I really want to see it. I want to see it thrive, but I want to see it maintain as much, like, OG Manhattan College as it can, because I was an English major amongst a sea of, like, engineering students, so I found that, like, I'm like, no, like, I have a great job, and I studied, like, books, like, you can do it, it's important, and I feel like, it feels like you're, like, shouting into a void a little bit, so, I don't know, but I appreciate your response, I appreciate the honesty, and also, like, that you recognize, like, how passionate people can be about that, so thank you.
Just to kind of finish things out, do you want to close it? I know time is running long, so I feel like this is a good point that I should thank our panel and thank you all for coming. And let's do some mingle for a few minutes. say hello if you didn't get your question asked or answered. Yeah, and thank you again.